Hello, this is Idodmg and welcome back to the channel. In this last Epoch video, I want to talk to you about some general tips and tricks to help get you through the campaign and on your way into the end game. We'll have the video timestamped for your convenience. Let's go ahead and talk about Last Epoch campaign. When you very first start playing Last Epoch, even if it's your first time, maybe you've played through the story many times, I hope you can still find some use out of this video. When you very first start a new character though, you're going to want to pick kind of a fantasy that you want to fit and mold in Last Epoch. Last Epoch is really great because there are loads and loads and loads of builds possible in this game. There's 5 base classes you can choose from, and each class has 3 different masteries you can pick from. We're not going to cover them all in depth, but you have the Mage, the Primalist, the Acolyte, and the Rogue. The Mage can become a Rune Master, a Spellblade, or a Sorcerer. Spellblade is probably my favorite out of the 3, Rune Master being a very close second. Over on the Primalist, you have Shaman, Beastmaster, and Druid. Beastmaster and Shaman are my probably most played. And then over on the Druid, you can be a shapeshifter into a Spriggan, and there's different werebear, and there's even an insect type of thing that you can shapeshift into that's really fun to play. Over on the Acolyte, you can be a Lich, which my favorite build on the Lich is the Harvest melee build, going into Lich form and just decimating enemies. You also have the Necromancer, which summons minions. Lastly, there's the Warlock that we'll be releasing with patch 1.0. This one is more of a spellcaster type of build, which also has curses, and I'm really excited to get my hands on the Warlock and make some builds for that class. You also have the Rogue, which can be a Blade Dancer, which is a melee type of class and is very, very powerful. You also have the Marksman, which I'm currently working on 3 different builds for, and you have the Falconer, which we're waiting for some news on that. I think at the time of recording, we'll get more information on Falconer tomorrow, but this build looks pretty fun, so you can have your trusty companion, and appears to be the Rogue's minion take on classes. Last but not least, you have the Sentinel, which is kind of like your typical warrior type of class, but in Last Epoch, like I said, there's so many different build options. With the Sentinel, you can become a Forge Guard, which is based around fire, and you can also summon like manifested armor that does damage as well, so it's kind of a minion build there. You could also be the Void Knight, which can even go back in time and reset your mana and health pool. The Void Knight is very fun and has a lot of really interesting mechanics. Last but not least, you have the Paladin, which is not only support, but also dishes out crazy damage. There's a lot of really powerful Paladin builds. There's honestly powerful builds for every single one of these. So as I said, your best bet is to pick which one seems the most interesting to you and what you want to build a fantasy around in Last Epoch. Once you've chosen a class and mastery and a fantasy that suits you, you're going to go ahead and jump into the game. Now you're going to start as your base class. The mastery will not unlock until around level 20 or so. It unlocks pretty early on in the story. The mastery is worth noting that you cannot change this. Once you have chosen your mastery, it is a permanent choice for that character. My main goal when I'm playing through the story on all of my characters is to just unlock all of the passive points and idle slots. These are unlocked from side quests as you play through the campaign. Once you pick up a quest, you can open up your map and click on the quest to see the quest rewards. In there you can see if it gives you a passive point and or idle slot. If so, you know you want to prioritize that mission. However, if it doesn't offer either of those, I still recommend doing it just so you can get a little bit more XP and check out more of the game. We'll talk a little bit more about campaign and kind of your goals while you're progressing through a little bit later in the video. For now, I want to go ahead and break down skills. When you very first start playing your character, you will be given a skill, and most of the classes you're given a skill that costs 0 energy to use, and this is a spammable ability. Most of these skills you can actually spec into and make them cost mana, do more damage, and lots of other interesting things as well. What I recommend doing though is just playing through, and you're going to unlock the early skills relatively quick while you're playing through the campaign. Once you find a skill that really suits you and is interesting to you, I would recommend really trying to see how you can work that into your build. In Last Epoch, you can specialize into up to 5 skills. This is the bread and butter for Last Epoch, and this is what makes Last Epoch really special in my opinion. There's other merits that make Last Epoch interesting, but this is one of them. Each skill in Last Epoch has its very own skill tree. Once you have specialized into a skill, it will start to gain XP and leveling up to a soft cap of level 20. So you can get 20 points to spend into your skill tree. You can go beyond level 20 with skills with special affixes on gear. I would also like to point out that once you specialize into a skill, you can actually despecialize the skill and switch to a different one if you want to. And as you level up your character, you'll have a baseline level of your new skills. So what that means is once you level up enough, If you decide to get rid of one skill and pick up another one to specialize into, it won't start at level 1. It'll start at a higher level based on your minimum skill level, which is, again, scales off of your character's level. On top of that, later in the end game, leveling up skills, you gain accelerated XP so that you can level up skills even quicker. So it really makes respecializing skills not that bad. And honestly, I wouldn't stress about it too much. Just try to find a skill that you find fun, try to work it into your build. And honestly, that's the fun in the game for Last Epoch, for me anyway, is trying out and tinkering with all the skills and builds in this game. Once you've picked a skill that you want to focus on, next you want to kind of pick what type of damage you want to deal. In Last Epoch, you don't want to do a bunch of different types of damage. Like you don't want to do poison, bleed, fire, lightning, cold. You don't want to do all these different ones on the same character. It's best to focus on one, maybe two different types of damage. And the reason for that is you're limited on how many different stats you can get to bolster up that damage type. So once you've picked a skill that you like, and hopefully it is the type of damage you want to do, or maybe you can convert it to that type of damage, you're going to want to look at the skill tags on the ability. Every skill in the game is scalable based on what tags are on that ability. For example, Shurikens is by default a physical throwing attack, and it also scales off dexterity. So anything with physical damage or physical shred or throwing damage or throwing attack speed and obviously dexterity are all going to make that skill do more damage. So you want to pay attention to the abilities tags, and you want to look for those type of stats on your gear. Speaking of stats on your gear, this is another really fun part of Last Epoch is itemization and puzzling in the best affixes for your build. One thing I want to point out up front is if you're going to run a damage over time ability, whether it be bleed or poison or ignite or shock or anything that does damage over time, necrotic damage over time, these by default cannot crit. So if you're running a damage over time build, do not worry about crit chance. However, if you're going to do like Shurikens, for example, and you want to scale its physical damage, throwing attack damage, and you're just going off the hit and not any of the damage over time stuff, you would want to focus on crit chance, and not only that, but crit multiplier. Very early on in the campaign, I do recommend just really upping your damage, and you can do that through crafting if you're not finding the drops you want to, and we'll talk about crafting a little bit later. Let's go ahead and keep talking about what type of affixes you should be looking for on your gear though. So with your offensive abilities, it's literally anything that matches your tags, and then you also have attack speed's good, and crit chance and crit multiplier are great as well. Every item in Last Epoch has 4 affixes on there. It has 2 prefixes and 2 suffixes. The prefixes are simply your offensive affixes. So those are going to be your damage modifiers are going to be the prefixes, and the suffixes at the end in general are your defensives. Now, this is mostly true except for weapons. You can actually get on your suffix, you can get some damage modifiers on there as well. But it's a good rule of thumb when you're looking at items to see where you can fit your damage modifiers and your survival modifiers. Speaking of survival, let's go ahead and talk about defenses. Very early on in Last Epoch, you're going to be encountering Void and Necrotic are going to be the first 2 main resistant types that I think you should be building up. Now, I'm not saying ignore all your other resistances. In fact, you want to do the opposite. You want to be working on your resistances as you progress through the campaign. By the time you hit endgame, you really want to try to have all your resistances up to the soft cap of 75%. Now, you can go past 75% resistances because some of the monsters in the game will actually shred your resistance, and so it's nice to have that little bit of cushion. Just resistance alone is not going to carry you, especially in the end game. You're going to want to layer on other forms of defense. Once you're progressing closer to the end of the story and really into the early end game and definitely the late end game, you're going to want to figure out what your layers of defense are going to be. For example, if you're playing a sorceress, you may want to lean into ward. Whereas if you're playing a sentinel or a melee class, you may want to go into block or dodge. Armor's also very important. On top of that, you also have endurance, and you have life leech and health regen. I personally am a giant fan of life leech. I also enjoy ward. I've tried all of these. They're all honestly serve their own purpose, and you'll figure out which one's best for your class and your character as you play the game. Before we jump into crafting, I also want to point out in Last Epoch, you have, when it comes to affixes, you have an added and increased value on different items. For example, health. You can find increased health, and you can also find added health. It is literally indicated by a plus sign or a percent sign. Now, you don't want to just stack one or the other. In fact, you want to try to balance the two a little bit, because the more flat health you have or plus health you have, the more your percentage is going to actually benefit. You're going to want to keep this in mind while you're looking for items, and especially when you start crafting. Crafting is probably the third most really important thing in Last Epoch. And the reason for that is crafting in Last Epoch allows it so the items you find that drop that may not be that great, you can make them really useful for your build. And you can also find items that are really good for your build and make them even better. This is more of a beginner guide video. So we're not going to do a deep dive into crafting, but if you get anything out of this video, don't be scared to start crafting. All the crafting materials drop pretty frequently, and you can also obtain them from items you don't want by using a Rune of Shattering. There are certain affixes in the game that are a little bit more rare, but early on and through the campaign, which we're focusing on in this video, the affixes you're going to be obtaining are pretty common. So don't be scared to craft. The most important thing to know about crafting is I recommend crafting on yellow items or higher. The white and blue items generally are not the best to craft on as they don't have very much forging potential. Forging potential is a stat you can find on each item, and this is literally how much you can craft on the item. Once you run out of forging potential, you can't craft on it anymore. Now, maybe you find a blue item early on that has your damage on it and you could add just one more to make it just a little bit better to squeeze out that damage. Go for it. By all means, push the forge to its absolute limit and don't be scared to mess around with it. There's a lot more that plays into crafting, but in this video, we're going to stay focused here and get you into the early end game and late end game, hopefully where you can start to worry about that more. And if you're enjoying the video, go ahead and hit that like button. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can find more guide videos for Last Epoch. We've covered a lot in this video, and I want to thank you for your time for hanging out while we talk about Last Epoch. A few more things I want to talk about in this video is gambling. Gambling on the NPC in town does cap out at level 40. I recommend saving all of your gold for stash slots and also for one of the endgame dungeons. There's a really good gold sink. Once you've followed all these tips and tricks and you've progressed through the campaign to where you've unlocked all of your idle slots and passive points, you're good to go on to the endgame. The early endgame consists of monoliths, which is basically its own island in a sense. And once you go in there, there are little nodes called echoes. As you complete these echoes, you will be able to unlock story echoes. Up here on the top left, you can see there's 3. The third one will have a boss in there. And the reason that these monoliths are so important is when you complete a monolith, to complete all 3 of the story echoes, you will get a choice of 3 blessings. The game will offer you 3 blessings and you can pick 1. However, each of these monoliths has a pool of different blessings you can pick. So if you don't get the blessing you want the first go around, you can rerun it to hopefully find the blessing you are searching for. Now, once you've completed all of these normal monoliths, you will then unlock empowered monoliths, which they're all level 100. And there's so much to do in the end game that I would love to keep talking about it here, but then the video would be like 3 hours long. But once you are into the empowered, the other part of end game is there is the arena, which is how you actually place on the ladder. These are endless waves of monsters, and you try to see what the highest wave is that you can clear to get onto the leaderboard. There's also end game dungeons, as I mentioned, and there is a lot to do. My favorite part of Last Epoch, though, is builds and crafting builds that are not only fun, but also viable. That's going to wrap it up for this Last Epoch video. Hopefully you enjoyed this campaign tips and tricks to kind of get you started onto the early end game progression. I really wish you the best of luck, and I hope you find a build that you find absolutely fun and addicting. There's loads out there and loads to explore. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget that like button and subscribe to the channel for more action RPG videos. The best way to support me is becoming a YouTube channel member today and or dropping a super thanks on the video below. Your view alone means the absolute world as always. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.